Hey everyone, my name is David Bowden, and I'm really excited to be hosting this live video session with you all. We're going to be waiting for people to hop on here, give you a little bit of information about myself. I am an author who lives in Oklahoma City. I run a nonprofit called The Poetic Inc., and we make videos that help people engage with the gospel. We're called Spoken Gospel. We try to speak the gospel out of every corner of Scripture and every corner of the world. And 2 years ago, my first book, When God Isn't There, came out, and now my second book is coming out this October, and it's called Rewire Your Heart, and the subtitle is Replace Desire for Sin with Desire for God. The book is all about how to fight sin, because I'm convinced that we've actually been going about fighting sin the wrong way. Not only are the ways that so many of us try to fight sin ineffective, a lot of the ways we fight sin are actually harmful to us. They actually hurt us as we try to fight sin. And so the book is really exploring a lot of those tools with how to fight sin, and really talking about how to fight sin with your heart, which is kind of a old idea in terms of people writing about it, but I'm trying to make it new and bring it to a new audience. And so Bible Gateway was kind enough to ask me to come on to their live video stream here and do a quick Q&A. They've sent me some questions that I'm going to try to do my best to answer. They definitely lobbed me some not softballs. What are those? Those are fastballs, I guess. And we're going to try to do my best here. So the first question is this: what does the title of the book, Rewire Your Heart, actually mean? It's a good question. The whole title is Rewire Your Heart, Replace Desire for Sin with Desire for God. So the reason I called it that was because a lot of us don't know it, but the heart is actually the center of a person. And so we think that the mind or the will is the center of the person, that if we want to fight sin and change our behaviors, that we have to think differently and use willpower and pull ourselves up from our bootstraps and just say no. And that's how we will change. That's how we'll be transformed. That's how we will eventually beat sin. But really, the heart is the center of the person. The Bible teaches us that over and over and over again. And so if we're ever going to actually change, we don't need to just change our minds or our wills. We actually have to change something far more deep and far more fundamental to who we are. We have to change our hearts. So our hearts have to be rewired. How do you do that? The essential part of the heart are the affections. They're the hardwired desires. And so, and desires, you'll learn as you read the book, can't be done away with. You can't stop wanting something. You can only replace desires. And the only way to replace a desire is to take a lesser desire and replace it with a greater desire. And so if you want to fight sin, the only way to do it is to take a weak desire for sin and replace it with a greater desire for God. That's how your heart gets rewired, and that's how you win the fight against sin. All right. The second question: what's the difference between a person's will and a person's heart? The difference, it kind of comes in if you understand how decisions and actions are actually made inside the human from a biblical point of view. And so the Bible teaches us that the heart is the center of the person, and that the heart actually moves the will. And so we have to understand that the heart kind of sits underneath it all, and the will is kind of what sticks out like an iceberg on top of the water, but the heart is everything else underneath. And so if you want to try to move the will, you actually first have to move the heart. And so the will is what you feel whenever it's like, I'm going to do this. The will is the decision that you make. I've made up my mind, I'm going to do this thing. That's when you will to do something. That's your will. But the heart is the desire you have to do or not do something. And you can't produce a will apart from a want. So you can't actually change what you're going to do and what you purpose to do unless you change what you want to do. So you actually have to address your heart before you can address your hands. Okay, question number 3. They ask about how in Romans 6, it talks about how Christians are dead to sin. So how can a Christian be dead to sin? It is kind of an odd question, because I shouldn't say an odd question. It's actually kind of an odd statement. It doesn't really feel like we're dead to sin a lot of the times, because we still sin. It's kind of a regular reality of the Christian life. So what does Paul in Romans 6 mean when he says that we are dead to sin? And so the answer is this: we have to understand that sin is not only an action, it's also a power. And so especially in Romans, and in Romans 7, he talks a lot about sin being a power and a force that's at work through the law. But in Romans 6, he's saying that we are dead to sin in that we are dead to the consequences and the punishment and the dominion of sin. Because sin's power, the Bible tells us, is in its ability to condemn us and to like put death over us. It's in its punishment. And so, but because in Christ, all the punishment of our sin has been dealt with because he took the wrath of God that was against our sin. He bore that. Therefore, the wrath that is against our sin is not there anymore. And so the power that sin had over us to come to us and like get in your brain and say, oh, you're not that good of a Christian. You're not that good of a person. There's no way God could love you. There's no way that Jesus has saved you. All of that condemnation that you feel, we're dead to it now. So we don't have to live under the dominion of sin anymore because sin has a power, and it's not just in its condemnation. That is a big part of it, like I've talked about. The other side of it is that sin is actually a powerful force that entered into the world after the fall of Adam and Eve. And it entered into the world and it changed our hearts. And so in Deuteronomy, we see that God gave all this long list of laws all through Exodus and Deuteronomy and Numbers, and you're supposed to follow this law. But at the end of Deuteronomy, we see this interesting thing. It says that like the people will not obey the law of God because God had not yet circumcised their hearts. Their hearts were still fallen. Their hearts were still under the dominion of sin. But both Jeremiah and Ezekiel, these prophets of the Old Testament, prophesied about a time when God would come and his Spirit would come in us and actually change our hearts so that we would be able to follow his law. He would circumcise our hearts and change us. He would rewire our hearts. And so that breaks the dominion of sin over us so that what happens when you become a Christian is not that you stop sinning altogether, but it's that you can actually do something good, something that is not sin for the very first time. So while you might not be completely dead to the ability to sin, you are completely dead to the dominion and the condemnation of sin. All right, so question 4. This leads pretty naturally into this question. It's a simple one. So what is sin? 3 short words, really big question. What is sin? I like to give this definition for sin. I think it's really straightforward. Sin is any attempt to get the good apart from God. You see, God, ever since the Garden of Eden, wanted to be our good provider. He wanted to give us good. But in sin, we say, I don't want to go to God and what he's given me for the good. I'll seek it any place else. So we run around to any other thing in the world trying to get good for ourselves any place other than God. And so God wants to give you good. And sin is any attempt to get the good for yourself apart from him. All right, so now the question is, so why then do we sin? If God has all this good stuff for us, then why are we going to other places to look for it? It's a really good question. I think a simple answer can be found in Genesis 3. Why did Eve sin? What was the first sin that was ever committed? Eve sinned, we're told, because she wanted to be her own god. That was the deception that the serpent offered her. And we sin for the same reason. We want to be our own god. We want to be autonomous. We want to provide for ourselves. We want to earn our own salvation. We want to earn our own keep. We want to separate ourselves from any other power that could lord over us. We want to be our own provider, our own gods. And so we sin because we want to be in control, and we don't want to relinquish control. And when Jesus comes to us and he says, like, I've paid for your sin. I've done everything necessary to save you. Just submit to me, praise me, worship me, put me above all else. We kind of repulse against that because we don't want to bend the knee. We don't want to submit. Even though it's free salvation that he's offering, we want to remain in control. And so the reason why we sin, the reason why we go to any other place except for God to try to find good is because we don't want God to be our provider. We want to be our own provider. Okay, so next the question is, so how do we not only stop doing wrong things, but how do we start doing right things? Another way to say that is, how do we stop sinning and start being holy? And the amazing thing about what I get to talk about in Rewire Your Heart, this book that's coming out, is those are one and the same answer. I love it, is that you get to do both at the same time. And so to stop sinning, what you have to do, as I mentioned at the very beginning, is you have to replace a weak desire with a stronger desire. And so, let's take a desire for sin and you replace that with desire for God. Well, that desire for God has then replaced this other desire for sin. So it's gone from your heart. You don't want to sin anymore. Your heart doesn't long for that thing. In fact, it starts to hate that thing. And so the heart, the bottom of the iceberg underneath it all, changes the will up here. So you stop doing those things. And as that happens, your focus is not on the thing that you're saying no to anymore. You're not focused on saying no, no, no to this sin. You're actually focused on saying yes, yes, yes to God and being delighted in Him, and your heart's being changed by Him. And as that happens, new wills start popping up. As your heart is changed, you start wanting to do new things. So your will is actually changed whenever your heart is changed. And so as you stop doing sin, you'll start doing holy things. But that will only take place if you experience a heart transformation. I think you could probably look at your own life and see that what I'm saying is true, because I'm sure a lot of you might have stopped doing one sin out of sheer willpower. But did you actually replace it with a joy-filled opposite reaction that was a holy thing? Most of the times, the answer to that is no. But whenever we actually replace our desire for that sin with a greater desire for God, then we won't only be saying no to the sin that was plaguing us to begin with. We'll actually start saying an equal and opposite yes to God instead. We'll stop doing bad things and start doing good things. I get to unpack this more in the book, but that's all I have time to say right now. Okay, so the next question, I like this one. Why does our fight with sin always feel like a losing battle? The answer is because the way we fight sin is wrong. It's so messed up. So we try to fight sin by looking at it and saying no to it and saying like, I've got to suppress my desires for that thing. I have to stop wanting it. What's wrong with me? And what we're failing to do is address something really good inside of us. And that good thing is that God made you to have feelings, to have emotions, to have desires, to want things. And so whenever you try to starve yourself of those things that you want, even though those are bad things, you starve yourself, you say you can't have any of those things, then you're going to feel terrible, and you're eventually going to be so hungry to be filled that you're going to run back to those old habits. You're going to have to, because you're so hungry for satisfaction and pleasure and peace and purpose. You're going to want those things. That's why you always are in the cycle of sin. That's why even whenever you beat sin, you don't really feel happy. You don't really feel joyful in your struggle with sin. But whenever you actually don't just say no to sin, but you actually say yes to God, you actually start feasting on Him and you start enjoying Him and relishing Him, then the battle with sin doesn't necessarily become this starvation game. It becomes a feasting game. And it's all about, how can I be more filled with God? How can I be more satisfied with Him? And then the battle with sin doesn't become this self-discipline, self-flagellation, self-deprivation endeavor. It becomes this joyful feast on the living God who will fulfill you more than any sin could. Okay, so why is self-control not the way to beat sin? This is a touchy subject because self-control is a great thing. In fact, it's one of the fruits of the Spirit. And so we have to be really careful here. I'm not saying that self-control is wrong. Self-control is very good. I think it's great for diet and exercise, for developing healthy routines, for learning to do good things in your life. Self-control and self-discipline helps with a lot of things in your life that you want to stop doing and start doing. But self-control can't change your heart. It can't change your desire for sin. That's because, as we've talked about, the heart lies deeper than the will. And all self-control does is address the will. It comes to you and says, stop doing that thing. But it doesn't provide your heart with a greater affection to want to stop doing that thing. And so you cannot just will yourself into submission to say no to a sin. You actually have to change your heart. Your heart has to be rewired if you're ever going to break free of the cycle of sin. And I would challenge you to actually think and say, like, think of the sin that you struggle most with, and think of all the times that you've tried to stop doing that sin. Has self-control really worked for you? Maybe for a season, but whenever it failed, and didn't you just jump right back into all the old patterns? Didn't you still want all the old things? No matter how terrible you felt afterwards, your heart was never changed towards that. And so self-control cannot kill sin because self-control cannot touch the heart. Okay, so I can tell whoever wrote this question actually read my book, which is really exciting. And it's what do you mean by passion over preference? So toward the beginning of the book, I get to have a little bit more time to make this argument that the heart is the center of the person. And I do so by saying it like this. I say that you only ever do what you want. And what I mean by that is we are always propelled by our desires. Our heart, not our will, controls what we do. And so we only ever do what we want to do. Immediately, people are going to say, I don't always do what I want to do. I don't want to wake up early in the morning and go to the gym. I don't want to eat a salad instead of a cheeseburger, but I do it anyway because I know I should and I have to and all these things. Or you might think of it like... or I guess to kind of talk about it and address it, let's think of it like this. Think of like if you were mugged. Yeah, you might not want to hand over your wallet to a mugger. That might not be something you want to do. If I just came up to you and asked you, hey, would you like to hand your wallet to a hardened criminal today? You'd probably be like, no. But in that moment, when that mugger has you at knife point, you want to save your life more than you want to hold on to your wallet. And so your prevailing want, your greatest desire, causes you to fork over your wallet to the mugger. So it's passion over preference. You might not prefer to give your wallet away, but your greater passion to keep yourself alive forces you to do that. And so in the idea of dieting and exercise, you don't necessarily prefer waking up early in the morning to go to the gym, but you have a deeper passion to be fit or to look good, and the same thing with diet and exercise. And so what I mean when I say that you only ever do what you want, you only ever follow your heart, I don't mean that you always do what you prefer, but I mean you always do what you are most passionate about. That's why we have to rewire our hearts. All right, well, we'll end with this last question. What is your favorite Bible verse and why? All right, we'll end with this last one here. The question is, what's your favorite Bible verse and why? I've got it pulled up here. I'll read it to you. It's Psalm 16:11. You make known to me the path of life. In your presence there is fullness of joy. At your right hand are pleasures forevermore. My whole life has been changed by this idea that the greatest pleasure in the world, the greatest point of my life, the greatest joy I will ever experience is in God's presence. Whenever I dwell with Him face to face, and I am nowhere but in Him, and that will occur whenever Jesus returns and brings the full presence of God to earth and brings the new heavens and new earth together, and we'll dwell with Him forever. I love that. It fills me with a lot of joy, but particularly for right now, what I love about this verse is that it is one of the chief ways that I constantly rewire my own heart. And so whenever my heart tricks me, whenever Satan tricks me, whenever sin tricks me into thinking that some earthly pleasure or some sin or some horrible thing will actually give me a greater joy than God, I can run back here and remind myself that the greatest joy I'll ever experience is actually in God's presence. It's actually not even a thing. It's a where. And the where is in God's presence. And so for me, whenever I can rehearse the idea that Jesus died for my sins to reconcile me to the Father so that I might live with Him in the greatest joy ever imaginable, my heart is all the bad desires of my heart are replaced with a greater desire, and that desire is to live with God forever. That's the path of life. Sin is the path of death. And so this verse is so important to me because I know that all the pleasures I'll ever seek are at God's right hand, where I'll experience them forevermore. So I hope all this has been helpful. It's been a lot of fun answering these questions as quickly as possible. Hopefully some of the answers were helpful to you. I just want to remind you all again to please check out my book, where I can go into way more detail about how to fight sin, how to change your heart with desires for God. It's called Rewire Your Heart. Replace desire for sin with desire for God. It's available right now on Amazon for pre-order. There'll be links available to get to all those places. So thank you again. My name's David Bowden. It's been wonderful being with you. Thank you, Bible Gateway, for giving me this opportunity. I hope you all have a great day.